A second U.S. aircraft carrier is moving toward the region, not announced with fanfare, not framed as escalation, just routine repositioning. That's how it always starts, quietly, procedurally. But when additional strike power closes in on a coastline already on edge, it's never about routine. It's about preparation. At the same time, President Donald Trump abruptly moves up his meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, officially scheduling efficiency, unofficially compression. Diplomatic calendars don't suddenly accelerate unless something underneath them is cracking. Publicly, Washington says negotiations with Tehran continue. Technical discussions, verification mechanisms, threshold compliance. Privately, carrier groups are converging. Inside Iran, the situation is no longer theoretical. What began as scattered protests has turned systemic. Live fire orders were first dismissed as rumors, then partially confirmed. Then the numbers started appearing and disappearing, tens of thousands within hours. Communications blacked out. Health ministry estimates briefly surfaced before being restricted. When casualty figures vanish that quickly, it's usually because they're worse than anyone is prepared to admit. This is no longer a crackdown. It's a pressure event, and pressure events do not stay contained. While Iran's leadership tightens internal control, U.S. naval assets reposition in parallel. When military movement and political acceleration happen in the same week, it's rarely coincidence. It's alignment. A second carrier group doesn't sail for symbolism. It sails because planners believe scenarios are narrowing. And here's what changes everything. If Washington and Tehran miscalculate even slightly, Israel becomes automatic collateral in any escalation. That's not speculation. That's geography and alliance structure. Every negotiation now carries a shadow timeline. Every delay buys someone time. The question is, who? Information inside Iran is fragmenting. Reports circulate of mass arrests, expanded security powers, internal strain within enforcement ranks. When regimes restrict communication at scale, it's not about optics. It's about containment. The faster information disappears, the more unstable the situation likely is. Meanwhile, intelligence assessments are being reassessed. Public statements remain measured. But when carrier groups reposition and emergency deployment readiness is discussed within hours, that's not diplomacy. That's contingency planning. Something has shifted. A regime under internal stress. A regional ally accelerating meetings. Two American carrier groups closing distance. Negotiations continuing in language that sounds calm, but feels compressed. If you think this is routine geopolitics, look again. Military timelines are moving faster than diplomatic ones. That imbalance is where history tends to break. And in the next segment, we're going to look at what U.S. intelligence reportedly did not expect, and why even internal projections may have underestimated what is unfolding inside Iran right now. Stay with this, because what happens in the coming days will not stay regional. American intelligence assessments, initially dismissive of the protests' destabilizing capacity, were quietly reassessed. Analysts do not revise models in real time unless the inputs violate assumptions. When casualty counts climb beyond projections, the question shifts from whether unrest can be controlled to whether control itself is fracturing. And this is where the main thing begins, not in the streets, but in the recalibration of institutions that believed they understood the balance. Then came a message from exile. Reza Pahlavi addressed the supreme leader directly, not with negotiation, but with dismissal. The phrasing was deliberate, confrontational, designed less for its target than for its audience within the security apparatus. He did not simply condemn the regime. He offered its enforcers an exit. He spoke to commanders, law enforcement, state employees, suggesting that history was already moving and that they could choose where to stand when it did. It seems rhetorical until you consider timing. An appeal to defect gains weight only when obedience is already uncertain. Almost simultaneously, reports emerged of internal unease within the Revolutionary Guard. A warning about desertion appeared through affiliated channels, then vanished. Deleted statements are often more revealing than published ones. The suggestion that disobedience required suppression indicates that disobedience existed. One soldier, according to accounts circulating within the region, was sentenced to death for refusing to fire on civilians. Executions restore fear, but they also expose vulnerability. Every enforcement action carries an implicit admission. Loyalty is no longer assumed. Meanwhile, the currency continued its descent. The real weakened to levels that rendered daily transactions unstable. Inflation did not present as theory, it presented as absence, absent savings, absent purchasing power, absent confidence. Economic erosion is not dramatic, it is incremental. But when it converges with visible repression, the effect compounds. A regime can survive ideological opposition. It struggles to survive empty markets. Beyond Iran's borders, diaspora mobilization reached a scale rarely coordinated so precisely. Dozens of cities observed synchronized demonstrations. Flags predating the Islamic Republic reappeared in public squares across continents. Coordination of that magnitude requires infrastructure, networks, funding channels, communication systems capable of bypassing domestic blackouts. It suggests preparation rather than spontaneity. But this part is rarely discussed openly. Publicly, President Trump maintained distance from Pahlavi, describing him in neutral terms while declining formal engagement. Privately, naval assets advanced and warnings intensified. Two vectors of pressure, internal dissent and external deterrence, began to align temporally. Whether coordinated or coincidental is less relevant than the effect. Compression from within and without alters decision space. The supreme leader addressed crowds marking the anniversary of the revolution, referencing the possibility of a return to the Pahlavi era. Leaders confident in their position rarely center speeches on exiled opponents. The tone carried strain beneath composure. When revolutionary anniversaries become defensive, it suggests that the narrative foundation requires reinforcement. And still, negotiations were said to be ongoing. Official statements emphasized restraint. Military exercises were described as routine. Yet carrier groups do not reposition at this scale without contingency modeling. Intelligence agencies do not rewrite projections unless variables exceed tolerance. Security services do not delete warnings unless cohesion is in question. It may appear as parallel developments, a naval adjustment, a speech from exile, a spike in unrest, a currency slide. But sequences matter. It seems insignificant until you connect the sequence. At this point, the system usually shows its limits, not in collapse, but in contradiction. Diplomatic language speaks of stability, while operational posture prepares for disruption. Domestic enforcement intensifies as public loyalty thins. Economic signals deteriorate as political rhetoric hardens. Nothing definitive has been declared. No formal transition has occurred. Yet certain thresholds, once theoretical, have been crossed quietly. A second carrier approaches. Appeals to the military circulate. Internal warnings surface and disappear. Intelligence models shift midstream. The structure remains intact for now. But the alignment of these pressures suggests that containment is no longer purely domestic, nor purely external. It is converging. And when convergence reaches a point where timing compresses faster than response, the surface calm becomes procedural rather than permanent. The question is no longer whether tension exists. The question is where the fracture line will reveal itself first. The fracture line begins inside the chain of command, not at the level of public statements, but in the flow of orders and the speed at which they are executed. When directives require reinforcement through execution, it means compliance has shifted from instinct to calculation. A system that once operated on ideological conviction begins to rely on deterrence within its own ranks. That transition is structural. It changes the internal logic from expansion to preservation. The Revolutionary Guard was designed as both shield and spine. Its authority extended beyond defense into industry, telecommunications, energy infrastructure, and logistics. That concentration of power ensured resilience until pressure arrived simultaneously from multiple vectors. When desertion reports surface, even briefly, it signals stress within the mechanism responsible for enforcing cohesion. The deletion of warnings is not merely censorship. It is containment of perception. If rank-and-file members observe uncertainty at the command level, uncertainty propagates faster than discipline. Pahlavi's appeal was calibrated precisely for this moment. He did not call for uprising alone. He introduced an alternative pathway for institutional survival. By framing defection as historical participation rather than betrayal, he reframed loyalty itself. In systems where hierarchy depends on inevitability, the perception that the future might exclude current leadership destabilizes obedience. Soldiers do not require certainty to hesitate. They require doubt. Externally, the presence of two carrier strike groups alters strategic mathematics without a single shot fired. Carrier groups are not symbolic assets. They represent layered capabilities: air superiority, electronic warfare, missile defense, long-range strike capacity. Their proximity compresses reaction time. For Tehran, this creates a dual imperative: maintain internal suppression while preserving deterrence posture. Resources diverted inward weaken outward projection. Resources preserved for outward defense reduce capacity for domestic control. The balance becomes arithmetic. Diplomatic negotiations continue because negotiations serve time. Time allows internal consolidation, financial maneuvering, and narrative adjustment. But time also allows external coalitions to align. The United States maintaining public distance from Pahlavi while reinforcing military positioning preserves deniability while expanding leverage. It prevents premature commitment to a successor while signaling to internal Iranian actors that alternatives are visible. Ambiguity becomes a tool. The economic dimension accelerates the structural strain. A currency collapsing to extreme ratios against the dollar is not simply a monetary issue. It affects procurement of essential imports, military components, and technology. Inflation undermines mid-level officers whose salaries no longer stabilize their households. Financial erosion penetrates the same institutions expected to enforce stability. Economic contraction, when combined with political uncertainty, shifts elite calculations from loyalty to preservation of assets. The diaspora mobilization adds another layer. Coordinated demonstrations across continents indicate funding streams, media infrastructure, and transnational communication channels operating beyond Tehran's reach. These networks shape narrative inside Iran through satellite signals and encrypted platforms. When domestic information control weakens, external narrative frameworks begin to fill the vacuum. Perception, once monopolized, becomes contested. Inside the leadership circle, consolidation narrows. Arrests of reformist figures indicate contraction of acceptable discourse. When moderates are detained, it eliminates internal pressure valves. The absence of controlled reform pathways increases the probability that dissent bypasses negotiation entirely. Historically, regimes that eliminate internal moderates accelerate polarization. Polarization simplifies choices for security forces: absolute enforcement or strategic withdrawal. Washington's intelligence recalibration suggests recognition that previous stability models underestimated nonlinear triggers. Mass casualty events shift public thresholds rapidly. They create moral inflection points within bureaucracies. Intelligence services adjusting in real time implies that escalation scenarios once categorized as low probability have migrated upward. Planning shifts from deterrence management to contingency preparation. Netanyahu's accelerated meeting with Trump aligns regional calculations. Israel evaluates Iranian instability through the lens of both security risk and opportunity. A fragmented command structure in Tehran may reduce coordinated proxy activity, but it may also increase unpredictability. The convergence of U.S. naval posture and Israeli strategic planning introduces a third dimension to Tehran's calculus. External deterrence is no longer theoretical positioning. It becomes immediate proximity. The system inside Iran now operates under simultaneous stressors: internal dissent, economic deterioration, elite contraction, and external compression. Each alone is manageable. Together, they require prioritization. Prioritization exposes hierarchy of fear. If the regime allocates resources towards suppressing streets, external posture weakens. If it preserves deterrence, domestic unrest deepens. The margin for error narrows. There is no declared collapse. Institutions remain operational, communications persist intermittently, but the logic of stability has altered. Control once derived from inevitability now depends on synchronization of suppression, currency stabilization, and deterrence signaling. Synchronization under pressure is fragile. It requires precise timing and unquestioned loyalty across layers that are already exhibiting strain. The carriers remain offshore. The appeals to defection circulate, intelligence models adjust, financial ratios deteriorate, internal arrests continue. None of these elements alone define outcome. Yet the alignment of military proximity, economic contraction, and internal doubt transforms what was once a contained authoritarian equilibrium into a dynamic system under compression. And when compression exceeds the elasticity of institutional trust, systems do not announce their transition. They shift quietly, sometimes overnight, sometimes in stages, but always first within the mechanism itself.